Astronaut, I already showed you my ID. You fit the description of a shoplifter. Turn around, sir.
I pay for my groceries. You're making a mistake, officer.
I said turn around. You don't make this harder than it needs to be.
I'm a Navy SEAL. You don't want to do this.
I don't care if you're a damn astronaut. You're being detained.
The dairy aisle of a nearly empty supermarket on a quiet Tuesday evening became the setting for one of the most documented and damning examples of racial profiling caught on video. Marcus Webb, dressed simply in a black t-shirt and khaki pants, had come only to buy milk and eggs before heading home after a long day of work. He was unremarkable in every way, just another customer shopping for groceries. But to Derek Hansen, a police officer who had just entered the same aisle, something about Marcus seemed wrong. Not what he was doing, but simply who he was. What would unfold in the next 7 minutes would be captured in high-definition video from multiple security cameras, revealing a brutal assault, blatant lies, and the arrogance of a man who believed his badge granted him the authority to do whatever he wanted. When the truth about who Marcus really was finally emerged, Derek Hansen realized he had made the biggest mistake of his career. The video spread across the internet like wildfire, reaching millions of views within hours, and every frame became undeniable proof that would destroy one man's life and vindicate another's struggle. Marcus Webb was not an ordinary civilian. At 34 years old, he was a Navy SEAL, part of the most elite special operations forces in the United States. He had completed 3 tours of duty in the Middle East, accumulated a drawer full of commendations for bravery, and participated in classified missions that would never be made public. He had saved lives under enemy fire and dedicated more than a decade of his existence to protecting a country that, in that supermarket aisle while wearing civilian clothes and carrying a shopping basket, seemed not to recognize his worth. But none of his accomplishments mattered to Derek Hansen as he approached with his hand already resting on his weapon. Derek Hansen was 38 years old with 12 years of service in the local police department. His record was deeply troubling: 3 complaints of excessive use of force, 2 accusations of inappropriate racial conduct that had been dismissed, and a well-known reputation among black residents as an officer who looked for trouble where there was none. His superiors had ignored the warning signs, filing away complaints with excuses about misunderstandings and high-pressure situations. Hansen had learned over the years that he could get away with almost anything as long as there was no clear video evidence or witnesses willing to speak against him. He approached Marcus without greeting, stopping about 10 feet away and watching him for an uncomfortably long moment. Marcus felt the familiar sensation that every black man knows, the feeling of being watched, judged, and presumed guilty of something for no reason at all. Marcus kept looking at the milk prices, deciding between brands, his cart containing only a few basic items: eggs, bread, fruit, the groceries of someone who lived alone and cooked simple meals. Nothing suggested any suspicious or illegal behavior, but Marcus's military training was already engaged, calculating distances, noticing reflections in the refrigerator glass, and mentally preparing for what his instinct told him was about to happen. He had faced armed insurgents in combat zones and navigated life-or-death situations, where a single second of hesitation meant the difference between coming home or coming back in a casket. Standing in an American supermarket buying groceries, he felt the same tension, the same adrenaline coursing through his veins. The difference was that in a war zone, he knew who the enemy was. Here, the enemy wore a badge and swore to protect and serve. Marcus took a deep breath, maintaining the calm he had been trained to keep under extreme pressure, and finally turned to face the police officer. Hansen stepped forward with aggressive body language and opened his mouth to speak the first words that would initiate a sequence of events ending with his career destroyed, his freedom taken, and his name becoming synonymous with everything wrong with racial policing. His voice cut through the silence of the aisle not as a question, but as an accusation, demanding to know what Marcus was doing there, as if being in a public supermarket buying groceries was a crime requiring explanation. Marcus responded calmly that he was shopping, keeping his voice neutral and respectful, even as anger began to simmer beneath the surface. He had learned early in life that reacting with emotion to this type of approach only made things worse. Years of military training had taught him to control his reactions, even in the most provocative situations. Hansen was not satisfied with the answer. He moved closer, invading Marcus's personal space in an intentional manner designed to intimidate. The security cameras captured every step, every facial expression, every movement revealing the officer's true intentions. Hansen claimed he had received reports of suspicious behavior in the area, an obvious lie he routinely used as justification for baseless stops. Marcus politely asked what kind of suspicious behavior, forcing the officer to specify something that did not exist. The question was simple and reasonable, but Hansen interpreted it as disrespect, as if a black man questioning his authority was an affront he could not tolerate. His expression changed in that moment. The mask of professionalism fell away to reveal something darker underneath. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and his entire body assumed a more aggressive posture. He stuttered for a second, trying to invent a specific answer about the suspicious behavior, realized he had no good response, and quickly changed tactics. Now he was demanding to see identification, his voice rising in volume and intensity as if Marcus had a legal obligation to obey without question. Marcus knew he was not legally required to show identification in a private store when he was not being accused of any specific crime. But he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. He had seen too many videos of police encounters that ended in violence because someone exercised their constitutional rights at the wrong time with the wrong officer. After a deliberate pause that left Hansen visibly irritated, Marcus slowly reached for his back pocket to retrieve his wallet. The movement was calculated and deliberate, keeping his hands always visible and moving in exaggerated slow motion to avoid any allegation that he was reaching for a weapon or representing a threat. But Hansen interpreted that slow, careful movement as defiance, as if Marcus was deliberately mocking him. His hand moved quickly toward his gun, fingers grazing the grip, and he aggressively ordered Marcus to keep his hands where he could see them. Marcus froze instantly, his hand halfway to his pocket, his body completely still, and calmly explained in a loud, clear voice that he was just getting his identification as requested. The contradiction was absurd and was being captured on video from multiple angles. Hansen had demanded ID and then reacted with potentially lethal hostility when Marcus tried to provide it. But this was exactly the kind of impossible trap that black people constantly faced in police encounters, damned if they complied and damned if they didn't. Other shoppers began appearing in the aisle, drawn by the obvious tension in Hansen's voice echoing through the store. An elderly woman with white hair stopped her cart a few yards away, watching the scene unfold with growing concern and confusion. She could not understand why a police officer was treating someone who was obviously just shopping with such aggression. A young couple, white and in their 20s, positioned themselves close enough to clearly hear every word being said, their faces showing growing shock as they realized they were witnessing a classic example of racial profiling happening right in front of them. Hansen noticed he now had an audience, multiple witnesses watching his every move. Instead of backing down or moderating his behavior, he felt even more pressured to assert his authority. In his mind, backing down would be admitting he was wrong, would be showing weakness in front of civilians. So he felt compelled to prove he was in control, that his actions were justified, that Marcus really was a threat or a criminal who deserved this treatment. It was the twisted logic of someone who had learned he never had to admit error, that the badge meant never having to say you were wrong. Marcus finally managed to take his wallet completely out of his pocket, moving even slower now that he knew he had witnesses, and offered his driver's license to Hansen with his hand extended and fingers completely visible. The officer grabbed it roughly, snatching it from Marcus's hand with unnecessary force, and examined it for an excessively long time, as if expecting to find something wrong. He checked the name 3 times, studied the photo, compared the address to his current location, looking for some discrepancy he could use as an excuse to continue the harassment. When he found nothing wrong with the identification, Hansen, instead of simply returning it and moving on like any reasonable officer would, began asking more questions. He demanded to know where exactly Marcus worked, why he had chosen to shop at this specific supermarket instead of one closer to his registered address, if he had any kind of criminal record, if he had ever been arrested before. Each question was more invasive than the last, each one designed not to obtain legitimate information, but to humiliate and diminish Marcus in front of the witnesses who now watched in shocked silence. Marcus answered every question with forced patience, explaining that he worked as a security consultant, a half-truth that protected the classified nature of his real work as a Navy SEAL. He did not mention his military service, did not reveal that he spent his days planning operations that saved lives and protected national interests. To Hansen, he was just another black man who needed to justify his existence in a neighborhood the officer apparently thought did not belong to him. The elderly woman watching finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly as she asked the officer if this was really necessary, if he could not see that the young man was clearly just shopping. Hansen turned to her with an expression that silenced any further objection. He said he was doing his job, keeping the community safe, and that she should move along if she did not want to get involved. The implied threat was clear. Questioning his authority meant potentially becoming his next target. The woman backed away, pushing her cart slowly down the aisle, but not before taking out her cell phone and starting to record. She was not the only one. The young couple also had their phones pointed at the scene, capturing angles the ceiling security cameras could not reach and recording audio with crystal clarity that would make any later claim that words were misinterpreted impossible. Then Hansen made the mistake that would transform this encounter from common harassment into something much more serious. He ordered Marcus to turn around and put his hands on the dairy shelf. Marcus calmly asked why he was being searched and what crime he was being accused of committing. Hansen did not answer the question, just repeated the order with more aggression in his voice. Marcus knew he was at a crossroads. He could obey an illegal order without probable cause, or he could refuse and risk the situation becoming violent. He chose a middle ground, complying with the movement but continuing to clearly verbalize that he was doing so under protest and without consent for the search. Hansen's hands were rough and invasive during the search, deliberately aggressive in a way that went beyond standard procedure. He slammed Marcus's ribs, pushed his shoulders against the cold shelf, and searched his pockets with unnecessary force while Marcus remained motionless and cooperative. Throughout the process, Marcus kept his voice calm but firm, repeatedly stating for the cameras and witnesses that he had committed no crime, that there was no probable cause for this search, and that he was not consenting to what was happening. He was creating a verbal record that would correspond perfectly to what the cameras were capturing visually. Hansen found nothing during the search because there was nothing to find. No weapon, no drugs, no evidence of any criminal activity, just a wallet, a cell phone, car keys, and a piece of paper with a shopping list. The lack of anything incriminating should have ended the encounter immediately and made Hansen realize he had made a mistake. But instead, the frustration of finding nothing to justify his actions only made him angrier. He grabbed Marcus's arm and spun him roughly to face him again, his fingers squeezing hard enough to leave marks that would be photographed later as evidence. It was at this moment that the situation definitely crossed the line from harassment to physical assault. Hansen shoved Marcus against the shelf with both hands, making dairy products fall and scatter across the floor. The impact made Marcus hit his head against the metal shelf with a sound that echoed through the aisle and made the witnesses gasp audibly. Marcus did not fight back, did not raise his hands in defense, did not make any movement that could be interpreted as aggressive. His military training screamed at him to react, to neutralize the threat, but his civilian mind knew that any movement could be used as justification for Hansen to escalate the violence even further or even use his weapon. The officer yelled in Marcus's face that he needed to learn some respect, that people like him needed to understand their place. The words were captured perfectly by multiple cameras and cell phones, the racist tone impossible to deny or reinterpret. Marcus looked directly into Hansen's eyes and calmly asked if the officer was finished, if he was free to leave now that the illegal search had found nothing. Marcus's calm seemed to enrage Hansen even more, as if his refusal to be intimidated or humiliated was the greatest offense of all. Hansen pushed Marcus again, this time with enough force to make him stumble backward and nearly fall. It was then that something changed in the atmosphere of the aisle. The young man from the couple who was recording shouted that this was assault, that they were filming everything. Another shopper, a middle-aged man who had stopped to watch, said loudly that he was going to call the police to report an officer attacking someone without reason. The irony of calling the police about the police was not lost on anyone, but it represented a critical shift. Hansen was no longer the only authority present. He now had multiple witnesses willing to intervene verbally and document his crimes. Hansen's expression changed when he realized he had lost control of the narrative. He looked around at the cell phone cameras pointed at him, at the faces of witnesses showing shock and condemnation. Something in his eyes revealed that he knew he had gone too far, but it was too late to back down, too late to make it seem like all of this had been a reasonable misunderstanding. Every second of the last 7 minutes was recorded from multiple angles, and no amount of lies or manipulation could change what those recordings showed. The supermarket manager, Robert Chen, finally arrived at the aisle, drawn by the shouting and commotion disrupting the normally peaceful environment of his store. He was a middle-aged man who had managed this establishment for over 15 years and knew most of his regular customers by name. When he saw the scene, Marcus pressed against the shelf with products scattered on the floor, Hansen in an aggressive posture, and multiple people recording on their cell phones. His expression went from confusion to alarm. He calmly asked what was happening, directing the question first to Hansen as a professional courtesy to law enforcement. Hansen immediately began constructing his false narrative, claiming that Marcus had been behaving suspiciously, that he had refused to cooperate with routine questions, and that he had tried to reach for something in his pocket in a threatening manner. Each word was a lie or a calculated distortion of the truth, spoken with the confidence of someone who had done this before and never faced consequences. But this time was different. Before the manager could respond, the elderly woman who had started recording interrupted, her voice trembling with indignation as she said this was complete lies, that she had witnessed everything from the beginning. The young couple joined her, confirming they had seen and recorded the entire encounter, that Marcus had done nothing wrong or threatening, and that the officer had been aggressive and physically violent without provocation. The middle-aged man who called the police also spoke up, saying he was on the phone at that very moment reporting an assault committed by a law enforcement officer. Hansen's expression went from confident to defensive as he realized that this time the witnesses were not staying silent, were not letting his version of the story go unchallenged. Robert, the manager, made a decision that would be crucial for everything that came after. He told Hansen that he had security cameras covering the entire aisle from multiple angles, recording continuously in high definition with clear audio. He offered to check the footage immediately to clarify exactly what had happened. The change in Hansen's body language was instant and revealing. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed with barely disguised anger. He said that would not be necessary, that he had handled the situation and that Marcus was free to leave. The sudden change in tone caught everyone by surprise. Moments before, Hansen had been aggressively interrogating and physically attacking Marcus, and now he was suddenly saying he could leave as if nothing had happened. Marcus understood perfectly what that change meant. Hansen was afraid of the security cameras, afraid of what they would show, and was trying to end the encounter quickly before more damage was done to his fabricated story. But Marcus was not ready to simply let this go. Not when his body still ached from the impact with the shelves, not when marks were forming on his arm where Hansen's fingers had squeezed with brutal force. Marcus calmly asked for Hansen's full name and badge number, information any officer should provide when requested by the public. Hansen hesitated, clearly not wanting to give this information, but aware that refusing in front of so many witnesses and cameras would only worsen his situation. He mumbled his name and badge number so quickly and quietly it was almost unintelligible. Marcus asked him to repeat it louder and slower, which Hansen did with barely contained anger permeating every syllable. Several witnesses noted the information on their phones, creating multiple independent records that would be impossible to contest or make disappear. Robert, the manager, then did something that would seal Hansen's fate. He said loudly and clearly, addressing Marcus but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, including the security cameras that were still recording, that Marcus was welcome in his store any time, that he had been a respectful and peaceful customer, and that the manager would personally ensure that the security footage was preserved and made available for any investigation Marcus wanted to pursue. He also offered to provide a written statement of what he had witnessed and help collect contact information from other witnesses willing to speak about what they saw. This public declaration of support completely changed the dynamic. Hansen no longer had any moral authority in the situation, no longer had the advantage of being the only official representative present. The manager of a respected business had essentially taken Marcus's side against a police officer, a move that required considerable courage, but that Robert clearly felt was necessary given what he had witnessed. Other witnesses began introducing themselves to Marcus, offering to send their video recordings, give their phone numbers for future statements, and express their shock and support. Hansen realized he had completely lost control of the situation. He tried one last time to reassert some authority, telling Marcus that if he had just cooperated from the beginning, none of this would have happened, victim blaming in a way that made several witnesses shake their heads in disbelief. Marcus responded with a calm that was far more powerful than any shouting could be, saying that he had cooperated completely, that he had committed no crime, and that the only person who had broken the law in that aisle was the officer who was now trying to escape the consequences of his actions. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited to see what Hansen would do next. For a moment, it seemed he might try to arrest Marcus on some fabricated charge, contempt of cop or resisting arrest, vague accusations that officers frequently used when they wanted to retroactively justify their actions. But with so many cameras recording, with the store manager clearly on Marcus's side, and with witnesses willing to contradict any lie he tried to tell, even Hansen had to recognize that making any additional moves would only dig a deeper hole for himself. Hansen finally backed away, taking a few steps back and trying to compose his expression into something resembling professional calm. But his eyes betrayed the panic he felt beneath the surface. He muttered something about having other calls to attend to and began to move away from the aisle, but not before casting a threatening look at Marcus that was captured perfectly by the cameras still recording. It was the look of someone who knew he had made a terrible mistake, but still was not ready to accept responsibility. The look of a man who blamed his victim for having the audacity not to bow before abuse of authority. Marcus remained motionless until Hansen was completely out of sight, his body finally relaxing from the tension he had maintained throughout the encounter. As soon as Hansen disappeared, the witnesses gathered around Marcus with genuine offers of help and expressions of outrage at what they had witnessed. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Dorothy Martinez, had tears in her eyes as she apologized repeatedly, as if somehow it was her fault this had happened. She said she had lived in that neighborhood for 40 years and had never seen anything so blatantly unjust and racist happening so openly. The young couple, Emma and Jason, were already uploading their videos to multiple social media platforms with detailed captions explaining what they had witnessed, tagging racial justice activism accounts and local civil rights organizations. Robert, the manager, took Marcus to his office in the back of the store to properly document the incident away from other shoppers. He offered water, ice for the bruise that was forming where Marcus's head had hit the shelf, and a private place to sit and process what had just happened. As Marcus drank water with hands that were finally beginning to tremble now that the adrenaline was wearing off, Robert was already making calls. First to the police department to file a formal complaint against Hansen, and then to his corporate office to inform them about the incident and ensure that the security footage was properly preserved and protected against any attempts at tampering or deletion. The footage was even more damning than anyone could have imagined. 3 different cameras had captured the complete encounter with crystal clarity, showing every shove, every expression of anger on Hansen's face, and every moment of Marcus's respectful calm in contrast to the officer's aggression. The audio picked up every word, including Hansen's racist statements about people like Marcus needing to learn their place. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation, no way for Hansen to argue he was just doing his job or that he had felt threatened. The cameras showed an innocent black man being harassed, assaulted, and humiliated by a police officer motivated by nothing but racial prejudice. Marcus finally allowed his own emotions to surface now that he was in relative privacy. He did not cry, but his voice trembled slightly when he explained to Robert that he had served his country for over a decade, that he had risked his life countless times on missions overseas, and yet a police officer had treated him like a criminal for buying milk in a supermarket. Robert listened in silence, his own face showing the anger and frustration he felt at the injustice he had witnessed. When Marcus casually mentioned he was a Navy SEAL, Robert was visibly shocked. The brutal irony of the situation hit him with full force. A man dedicated to protecting his nation had been brutalized by someone sworn to protect and serve. In the following hours, videos of the incident began spreading across the internet with impressive speed. Emma and Jason's recording reached 10,000 views in the first 2 hours, 50,000 by the end of the day, and was well on its way to 1 million before the week was over. The comments were almost universally outraged and supportive of Marcus, with people sharing their own experiences of racial profiling and applauding the witnesses for not staying silent. Local civil rights organizations began reaching out, offering free legal representation and support. Attorneys specializing in police misconduct called, offering their services and recognizing this as exactly the kind of case with irrefutable evidence that could set important precedents. The police department initially tried their standard response, a generic statement saying they were aware of the incident and would conduct a full internal investigation. But the public pressure was immediate and intense. People did not want an internal investigation that historically resulted in nothing more than paid leave, and eventually the officer returning to work as if nothing had happened. They wanted real consequences, real accountability, and were willing to maintain the pressure until they got it. Protests were organized outside the police station, not large demonstrations, but persistent groups of concerned citizens holding signs and demanding Hansen be fired and criminally charged. Local media picked up the story when the videos became impossible to ignore. Investigative reporters began digging into Hansen's history and discovered what the black community had known for years. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior the department had consistently ignored or minimized. Previous complaints that had been filed away were re-examined in new light, with previous victims now feeling empowered to speak publicly about their experiences, especially now that they had video evidence that they were not exaggerating or being too sensitive. A woman named Tasha Williams came forward describing how Hansen had stopped her, while she was walking home from work 2 years earlier, subjecting her to 20 minutes of humiliating interrogation without cause before finally letting her go with a warning not to cause trouble in the neighborhood. Marcus, meanwhile, sought medical attention to document his injuries, even though they were relatively minor. The bruises on his arm where Hansen had squeezed, the small contusion on his head from the impact with the shelf. Everything was photographed and documented by medical professionals who could testify about the nature of injuries consistent with physical assault. He also sought out a civil rights attorney named Jennifer Okonkwo, a black woman who had built a formidable reputation representing victims of police misconduct, and who saw in Marcus's case not just a client but a cause that could force real systemic changes. Jennifer reviewed all the evidence, the security footage, the cell phone videos from witnesses, the written statements, Hansen's history, and told Marcus without any ambiguity that he had one of the strongest cases against police misconduct she had ever seen. The video evidence was so clear, so incontestable, that there would be no way for the department or the city to dodge responsibility. She recommended a dual strategy: a criminal complaint against Hansen for assault under color of authority, and a civil lawsuit against both Hansen personally and the police department for civil rights violations, excessive use of force, and failure to properly train and supervise their officers. The criminal complaint was filed within a week, not through the police department that had shown years of willingness to protect Hansen, but directly through the district attorney's office, which was under immense public pressure to act. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Mitchell who had campaigned on promises to reform how police misconduct cases were handled, had no choice but to take the case seriously given the video evidence that had already been seen by hundreds of thousands of people. Hansen was formally charged with assault under color of authority, oppressive official conduct, and civil rights violations, charges that carried the possibility of years in prison if convicted. The police department, realizing it could no longer defend the indefensible without completely destroying its public credibility, placed Hansen on unpaid administrative leave while the criminal case moved forward. But this was not enough to calm public outrage. Protesters continued showing up, demanding not just Hansen's firing, but also calling for the resignation of the police chief who had overseen years of complaints being filed away and ignored. The pressure worked. 3 weeks after the incident, Hansen was officially fired from the department. His law enforcement certification was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal trial, effectively ending any possibility of him working as a police officer again in any jurisdiction. The civil lawsuit moved simultaneously with Jennifer Okonkwo building a meticulous case that went beyond the simple supermarket incident. She documented Hansen's pattern of behavior, presented testimony from other victims of his racially motivated harassment, and most critically exposed how the police department had systematically failed to respond to complaints about him. She argued the city was liable not just for Hansen's actions that day, but for years of negligence that allowed a racist officer to continue victimizing people without consequences. Discovery revealed internal emails showing supervisors were aware of Hansen's problematic behavior, but chose not to act, fearing battles with the police union, or simply not considering complaints from black residents as a priority. Hansen's criminal trial began 6 months after the incident and was one of the most one-sided cases the courthouse had seen in years. The prosecution presented the security footage and witness videos, which spoke for themselves with devastating clarity. Witnesses took the stand and described exactly what they had seen, their accounts remaining consistent under cross-examination, because they were simply telling the truth the cameras had already confirmed. Marcus testified with the same calm he had demonstrated during the incident itself, refusing to be provoked by Hansen's defense, which tried desperately to paint him as somehow threatening or uncooperative. Hansen's defense strategy collapsed quickly when his own attorney realized he had nothing to work with. He tried arguing that Hansen had felt threatened by Marcus's physical size, but this was demolished when the prosecution pointed out that Marcus was literally shopping with a list in his hand when approached. They tried suggesting Marcus's tone was disrespectful, but audio recordings showed Marcus being polite and respectful, even as his rights were being violated. They tried framing the physical shoves as standard containment techniques, but use of force experts testified there was no legal justification for any physical force to be used against someone who was completely cooperative and posed no threat. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge, an African-American veteran of the bench who had spent decades watching police misconduct cases, held nothing back in her remarks during sentencing. She spoke about how officers like Hansen betrayed the public trust and stained the reputation of good police who did their jobs with integrity. She noted that victims of his previous behavior who never got justice deserved recognition, and that Marcus was fortunate enough to have the resources to fight back in a way many did not. She sentenced Hansen to 4 years in state prison, the maximum penalty allowed under sentencing guidelines, sending a clear message that abuse of authority would not be tolerated. The civil lawsuit settlement came shortly after, with the city agreeing to pay Marcus a substantial amount that legal observers estimated to be in the 7 figures. But Marcus had made clear from the beginning that money was not his primary goal. As part of the settlement, the city agreed to comprehensive structural changes. Mandatory retraining for all officers in implicit bias and de-escalation, creation of an independent civilian oversight board with real power to investigate misconduct, implementation of an early warning system to identify officers with patterns of complaints before they became Hansen cases, and a commitment to make public all-body camera footage of incidents involving use of force within 30 days, unless there were specific legal reasons not to. Dorothy Martinez, the elderly woman who had been one of the first to speak up and start recording, was interviewed by a local news station about the outcome. With tears of relief streaming down her face, she said that for the first time in decades she felt hope that things could actually change, that maybe her granddaughters would grow up in a world where officers like Hansen could not hide behind badges while brutalizing black people. Emma and Jason, the young couple whose video had helped catalyze public outrage, spoke about how witnessing the incident had changed their understanding of privilege and responsibility. They explained how they had become more conscious and willing to use their voices and cameras to document injustice wherever they saw it. Marcus used part of his settlement to establish a foundation that would provide legal support for victims of police misconduct who did not have resources to fight alone. He partnered with Jennifer Okonkwo to create a program that connected victims with attorneys willing to do pro bono or reduced fee work on meritorious cases. The foundation also worked to educate communities about their rights during police encounters, distributing materials in churches, community centers, and schools about how to stay safe while asserting constitutional rights. Marcus rarely spoke publicly about the incident itself, preferring to let the video and court outcomes speak for him. But when he did speak, he always emphasized that he was not special or unique. He was just someone lucky enough to have brave witnesses and clear video evidence. Hansen served his sentence in a state prison where his previous existence as a police officer made him a constant target for hostility from other inmates. He never publicly admitted he was wrong, never genuinely apologized to Marcus or his other victims, and never demonstrated any real understanding of how his racism had ruined lives. When released after serving 3.5 years with good behavior, he left the state and disappeared from public view. His name became permanently associated with articles about his crime and conviction, eventually becoming a case study in police training programs across the country about exactly the kind of officer departments needed to identify and remove before they caused irreparable harm. The supermarket where it all happened became an unintended landmark in the community. Robert Chen, the manager whose quick decision to preserve and share security footage had been crucial to obtaining justice, was promoted by the corporation, which recognized he had done the right thing even when it would have been easier not to get involved. They installed a small, discreet plaque near the dairy aisle, acknowledging the location as where ordinary citizens became extraordinary advocates for justice through their willingness to witness truth. Marcus still shopped there occasionally, though now he was recognized and often stopped by people wanting to express support or share their own stories of police encounters. 3 years after the incident, a documentary was made about the case and its broader impact on national discussions about policing and accountability. It featured interviews with Marcus, with the witnesses, with Jennifer Okonkwo, and even with some officers from the same department who spoke anonymously about how the case had changed internal culture around how they thought about use of force and racial bias. The documentary ended with a sobering statistic. For every case like Marcus's where video evidence led to justice, there were countless others where no camera was rolling, no witnesses were willing to come forward, and no justice was achieved. But it ended on a hopeful note, suggesting that each case handled correctly made the next one slightly easier, and each officer held accountable made others think twice before abusing their power. Marcus eventually left his work with the Navy SEALs, not because of trauma from the supermarket incident, but because he had found a new mission that felt equally important. He began working full-time with his foundation, traveling to communities across the country, training people about their rights, speaking to police departments about how unconscious bias leads to encounters like the one he experienced, and lobbying for legislative changes that would make it easier to hold officers accountable who violated civil rights. He had spent over a decade protecting Americans from foreign threats. Now he would dedicate the rest of his life protecting them from domestic threats, fighting against those wearing badges and uniforms that did not honor what those symbols were supposed to represent. The story of Marcus Webb and Derek Hansen was not unique, but the outcome was, because of cameras that captured truth, because of witnesses who refused to stay silent, because of a manager who made the right choice, and because of a victim who had the resources and determination to fight for justice. This case did not end with another black man being victimized without consequences. It ended with a racist officer in prison, with policy changes implemented, with a foundation created to help others, and with a message sent that even the flawed system could sometimes work when ordinary people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The transformation of a routine shopping trip into a moment of national reckoning demonstrated that accountability was possible, that witnesses mattered, and that the truth, when captured and amplified, could force even entrenched systems to change.